The great hall of Ashgrove Kingdom fell silent the moment the doors slammed shut behind Illyra Voss. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her, but she could feel none of them. She could only hear the sharp intake of breath from the crowd, the creak of old wooden benches, and the low growl building in the throat of the man seated on the high stone throne above her. Alpha King Damien Ashgrove did not rise to greet her. He did not need to. His presence alone pressed down on the room like a storm about to break. Illyra stood at the center of the hall, her white cane resting lightly in her hand, her chin lifted with a calm that unsettled everyone watching her. She could not see his face, but she did not need to. She could hear the tightness in his jaw when he finally spoke. "Bring her forward," Damien said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. 2 guards stepped toward Illyra, but she moved before they could touch her. She walked forward on her own, counting her steps out of habit, her senses sharp and alive in ways the people around her could never understand. The scent of candle wax, old stone, and nervous sweat filled the air. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a woman whispered something cruel, and a man beside her laughed under his breath. Illyra did not flinch. She stopped exactly 6 feet from the throne, close enough to feel the heat radiating from the great fireplace behind Damien, but far enough to keep her dignity intact. "You wish to see me, my king," she said, her voice steady despite the storm rising inside her chest. Damien's eyes, a deep and furious gold, studied her from head to toe. She was dressed simply, her dark hair braided back, her expression calm. There was nothing about her that looked broken or weak, and that only made him angrier. "The elders tell me," he said slowly, "that the moon goddess has chosen you as my mate." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Illyra kept her chin high. "I do not need the elders to tell me that," she said. "I felt the bond the moment I stepped into this kingdom 3 days ago. I assume you felt it too." Damien's hands tightened on the arms of his throne. He had felt it, a pull so strong it had nearly brought him to his knees in front of his entire council. He had spent 3 days trying to convince himself it was a mistake, that the goddess could not possibly be so cruel as to bind the strongest alpha king in the northern territories to a blind woman. "A king cannot have a mate who cannot see," he said, his voice dropping into something dangerously quiet. "A king cannot have a mate who cannot fight, who cannot track an enemy through the woods, who cannot even look upon her own children without help. Do you understand what you are asking of me?" "I am not asking anything of you," Illyra said, and for the first time, a small edge crept into her voice. "The bond is not something either of us chose. It is not something either of us can undo with words. Watch how you speak to your king," growled one of the council members near the throne, a broad-shouldered man named Callum Bright, who had long hoped his own daughter would be chosen as Damien's mate. Illyra turned her head slightly toward the sound of his voice, unbothered. "I speak to him the way I would speak to any man who insults me in public," she said, "crown or no crown." A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the hall. No one spoke to Alpha King Damien Ashgrove that way. No one dared. Damien rose from his throne at last, descending the stone steps with slow, deliberate movements. Every wolf in the room could feel the weight of his aura, pressing down like a physical force. He stopped in front of Illyra, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body and the barely restrained fury rolling off him in waves. "You have courage," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "I will give you that. But courage does not change what you are." "And what am I?" Illyra asked, refusing to step back. "A liability," Damien said. "A weakness the goddess has cursed me with." The words struck harder than she expected, but Illyra did not let it show. She had spent her whole life proving people wrong about what a blind woman could or could not do. She was not about to let a king, no matter how powerful, break that resolve now. "I did not choose to be blind," she said, "just as I did not choose to be your mate. But I will not stand here and let you call me a curse, because you are too proud to see past what your eyes tell you." For a moment, something flickered across Damien's face, something that almost looked like doubt, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath the weight of pride and years of believing that strength was the only thing that mattered. "I cannot accept this bond," he said, loud enough now for the entire hall to hear. "Not publicly. Not as my Luna. You may remain in the kingdom under my protection, but you will not stand beside me as my equal." The silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. Illyra felt the eyes of the crowd on her, felt their pity and their scorn, and beneath both, she felt something else stirring inside herself. Not sadness, not yet. Something closer to quiet, burning resolve. "You misunderstand me, my king," she said finally, her voice steady and clear. "I did not come here asking to be your equal. I do not need your crown to know my own worth." She turned before he could respond, her cane tapping softly against the stone floor, as she walked toward the doors of the great hall. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, crueler, but she did not slow her pace. She had faced worse than gossip in her life. She had faced a world that told her, again and again, that a blind woman had no place among the strong. She would not let a king's rejection be the thing that finally broke her. Outside the hall, the cold night air hit her face, sharp and clean after the suffocating heat of the throne room. She stood on the palace steps for a long moment, listening to the distant sound of wolves howling somewhere beyond the kingdom walls. It was a sound of freedom, of wildness, of a life she had never quite belonged to. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the strange, aching pull of the bond even now, even after everything Damien had said. It did not fade simply because he wished it to. If anything, it burned brighter, a quiet reminder that fate rarely cared about pride. Footsteps approached from behind her, light and hesitant. Illyra recognized the scent before the voice spoke. "That was either very brave or very foolish," said a young woman's voice. It was Marisol, one of the palace servants who had been kind to Illyra since her arrival, a rare gift in a place that seemed determined to treat her as an outsider. "Perhaps both," Illyra said, allowing herself a small, tired smile. "He has never spoken to anyone, the way he just spoke to you," Marisol said. "Not even his own council. I have never seen him so unsettled." Illyra tilted her head slightly. "Unsettled is not the same as sorry." "No," Marisol agreed, "but it might be the beginning of it." Illyra said nothing to that. She did not believe pride, like Damien's, could be undone so quickly. Not by words, not by a single confrontation in a crowded hall. Men like him needed to lose something before they understood what they had thrown away. She did not yet know how right she was. Inside the great hall, Damien remained standing where Illyra had left him, his fists clenched at his sides, his breathing uneven. Callum Bright approached him slowly, careful not to provoke the storm still simmering beneath the king's skin. "You made the right decision, my king," Callum said. "A blind Luna would only invite challenge from the other packs. They would see it as weakness." Damien did not answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the doors Illyra had walked through, and for reasons he could not explain, he found himself replaying her words over and over in his mind. She had not begged. She had not cried. She had simply told him the truth and walked away, leaving him standing alone, with a bond that refused to loosen its grip on his chest. "Leave me," Damien said finally, his voice quiet but final. Callum bowed and retreated, along with the rest of the council, until the great hall stood empty, except for the king and the dying embers of the fireplace behind his throne. Damien sat back down slowly, staring at the space where Illyra had stood only minutes before. He told himself he had made the right choice. A king needed strength beside him, not weakness. A king needed a Luna who could stand on the front lines, who could look an enemy in the eye and not flinch. He told himself this again and again, waiting for the words to feel true. They did not. Somewhere deep inside him, beneath the pride and the fear of what the other packs might think, a quiet voice whispered that he had just made the greatest mistake of his life. He silenced it the way he silenced every doubt that dared to challenge his authority, burying it beneath the cold, hard mask of the king he had trained himself to be since childhood. He did not know, not yet, that the moon goddess did not forgive a broken bond so easily. He did not know that somewhere beyond the palace walls, forces were already stirring, forces that would soon test his kingdom in ways he never expected. He did not know that the woman he had just rejected in front of his entire court would one day be the only person capable of saving everything he claimed to protect. All he knew, sitting alone in the dying firelight, was that for the first time in his life, silence felt unbearably loud. Outside, beneath a sky scattered with cold stars, Illyra walked slowly toward the small cottage she had been given, at the edge of the palace grounds, her cane tapping a steady rhythm against the stone path. She did not cry. She refused to give anyone, especially herself, that satisfaction. But as she reached the door of the cottage and stepped inside, she allowed herself one quiet moment to feel the full weight of what had happened. A king had looked at her, and seen only what she lacked. A king had called her a curse in front of his entire kingdom. She pressed her palm flat against her chest, feeling the strange pulse of the bond beneath her fingers, and made herself a quiet promise in the darkness of the small, unfamiliar room. She would not beg for his acceptance. She would not shrink herself to fit into the small, cruel box he had built around her. If Damien Ashgrove wanted to see her as a weakness, then one day, he would learn exactly how wrong he had been. And when that day came, she would not be the one on her knees. 3 weeks passed inside the walls of Ashgrove Kingdom, and in that time, whispers about the blind mate spread through every corner of the pack like smoke through dry grass. Elira could not see the sneers, but she heard them clearly enough in the tone of voices around her, in the way conversations stopped abruptly when she entered a room, in the way even the servants who once smiled at her now spoke to her with careful, distant politeness. She had learned long ago that pity often wore the same mask as kindness, and she refused to accept either. On this particular morning, the sun had barely risen over the eastern hills, when Elira made her way through the training grounds behind the palace, her cane sweeping gently in front of her, as she walked the familiar path toward the herb garden. She had discovered the garden during her first week in the kingdom, tucked behind a crumbling stone wall where few people bothered to wander. It had quickly become the only place in the entire palace where she felt something close to peace. She knelt beside a patch of silverleaf, running her fingers carefully over the plant's delicate stems, when the sound of raised voices drifted toward her from the training yard beyond the wall. "She cannot even see the enemy coming," one voice sneered. It belonged to a young warrior named Garrick, one of Damien's personal guards, known throughout the pack for his sharp tongue and sharper ambitions. What kind of Luna hides in a garden while real wolves train for battle? Laughter followed, cruel and careless. Elira's fingers stilled over the silver leaf, but she did not rise. She did not need to see their faces to know the expressions they wore, the same mixture of amusement and contempt she had grown used to since childhood. What surprised her was the flicker of anger that rose in her chest, sharper than usual, fueled by weeks of swallowed insults and quiet humiliation. She stood slowly, brushing the soil from her hands, and walked toward the sound of their voices with steady, unhurried steps. The laughter died the moment she stepped through the gap in the stone wall. "Elira," Garrick said, his voice suddenly less confident now that she stood directly in front of him. "We were just discussing my ability to fight," Elira finished for him, tilting her head slightly toward the sound of his breathing. "Please, continue. I would love to hear the rest." A few of the younger warriors shifted uncomfortably, but Garrick, eager to save face in front of his companions, squared his shoulders and stepped closer. "It is a simple truth," he said. "You cannot defend yourself, let alone a kingdom. If an enemy stood in front of you right now, you would not even know it until their blade was already at your throat." Elira felt the challenge in his words settle over her like a familiar weight. She had spent years training with a blind mentor from her home village, a woman who had taught her that sight was only one sense among many, and rarely the most important one in a true fight. "Would you like to test that theory?" Elira asked calmly. A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the small crowd gathering around them. Garrick blinked, clearly not expecting her to accept a challenge, rather than retreat from one. "You want to spar with me?" he asked, a slow grin spreading across his face, the kind of grin that assumed victory before the fight had even begun. "I want you to stop assuming things about me that you know nothing about," Elira said. "A friendly spar seems like the fastest way to settle that." Word spread quickly across the training grounds, and within minutes, a small crowd had gathered to watch, drawn by curiosity and the promise of entertainment at the blind mate's expense. Elira could feel the weight of their attention pressing against her skin, but she refused to let it shake her resolve. She removed her cane and handed it to a nearby servant girl, who took it with wide, nervous eyes. "Are you certain about this?" the girl whispered. "More certain than I have been about anything in weeks," Elira replied. Garrick circled her slowly, his confidence radiating off him in waves. He was younger than Damien, but strong, quick, and trained since childhood in the art of combat. He expected an easy victory, a quick way to prove his point and earn a laugh from his fellow warriors. He lunged first, testing her with a fast, shallow strike toward her shoulder. Illyra moved before his fist connected, stepping sideways with a precision that startled even herself, her senses tracking the shift in air pressure, the sound of his feet against the packed earth, the subtle change in his breathing that always came a heartbeat before he moved. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Garrick's eyes widened, but he recovered quickly, launching a second strike, then a third, each one faster than the last. Illyra dodged them all, her body responding instinctively to sensations most people never bothered to notice: the whisper of displaced air, the vibration of footsteps through the ground, the subtle tension in a voice right before an attack. When Garrick finally overextended on a fourth strike, frustration beginning to crack his composure, Illyra stepped inside his reach and swept his legs out from under him with a smooth, practiced motion. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs, stunned silence falling over the crowd. Illyra stood over him for a brief moment, her expression calm, almost gentle. "I cannot see your face," she said quietly, only loud enough for him to hear. "But I imagine it looks quite different than it did a few minutes ago." She stepped back and allowed him to rise, refusing to gloat, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of watching her celebrate. She simply retrieved her cane from the wide-eyed servant girl and turned to walk away, leaving Garrick sitting in the dirt, humiliation burning hotter across his face than any bruise could have caused. Word of the spar reached Damien before the sun had fully risen over the palace towers. He found himself standing at his study window, staring down at the training grounds, where the crowd was still slowly dispersing, his advisor Callum Bright relaying the story with poorly hidden disbelief. "She defeated Garrick without landing a single blow he could counter," Callum said. "The men are calling it luck." "Was it luck?" Damien asked, though something in his gut already told him the answer. "I do not believe so, my king," Callum admitted reluctantly. "She moved as though she could see every strike before it happened." Damien said nothing, his gaze fixed on the training grounds below, though Illyra herself was no longer visible, already gone, already walking away from the spectacle she had never wanted to create in the first place. He told himself the outcome meant nothing, that a single spar proved nothing about her ability to survive in a world built on strength and violence. But the quiet, nagging doubt from weeks ago returned, sharper this time, refusing to be dismissed so easily. He had called her a weakness in front of his entire kingdom, and yet, somehow, without his help, without his protection, she continued to prove that assumption wrong, one quiet, undeniable moment at a time. That evening, as the palace settled into darkness, and most of its residents retired to their chambers, Damien found himself walking, almost without meaning to, toward the edge of the grounds where Illyra's cottage stood alone, beneath a canopy of old oak trees. He stopped several yards away, hidden in shadow, watching the soft candlelight flicker behind her window. He did not know what he intended to say if she opened the door. He did not know why he had walked there at all, when every instinct told him to stay far away from a bond he had already sworn to reject. He stood there for a long while, listening to the quiet sounds of the night, before finally turning and walking back toward the palace, leaving his questions unanswered and his doubts unresolved. He did not yet know that far beyond the borders of his kingdom, a storm far more dangerous than wounded pride was already beginning to gather, one that would soon make his rejection of Illyra the most costly mistake of his entire reign. The trade envoy from the neighboring Thornfield kingdom arrived on a gray morning, 3 carriages rolling through the palace gates, escorted by a dozen armed riders. Illyra stood near the entrance hall, listening to the commotion of hooves, and shouted greetings, unaware that within the span of a single day, her entire world would collapse around her. The envoy, a sharp-eyed woman named Priscilla Thorne, had traveled to Ashgrove Kingdom to finalize an agreement that had taken Damien nearly a year to negotiate, a trade pact that would secure vital resources for both packs during the coming winter. Every detail mattered. Every signature, every sealed document, every promise exchanged between the two kingdoms carried weight that could shift the balance of power across the northern territories. Illyra had no direct involvement in the negotiations. She had never even met Priscilla Thorne. But that fact would matter little by the time the day was over. It began with a missing document, a single page containing critical terms about resource distribution, discovered gone from the locked study where Damien kept his most sensitive papers. Panic spread quickly through the palace, as guards searched every room, every hallway, every possible hiding place, desperate to recover it before the signing ceremony scheduled for that evening. The document was found hours later, crumpled, and partially burned in the fireplace of Alira's own cottage. Alira had been in the herb garden when the guards arrived at her door, and she returned to find her small home filled with armed men, their voices tense and accusing, their eyes filled with a suspicion she could feel even without seeing it directly. "What is happening?" she asked, standing frozen in her doorway. "You know exactly what is happening," snapped a guard she did not recognize, his voice thick with barely restrained hostility. She was brought before Damien within the hour, standing once again in the great hall, though this time the atmosphere was far different from her first humiliating encounter weeks earlier. This time, the entire council had gathered, along with Priscilla Thorne herself, her sharp eyes studying Alira with open suspicion. Damien sat rigid on his throne, his expression unreadable, though the tension radiating from his body was impossible to miss. "The document that would have secured our trade agreement was found burned in your fireplace," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Explain yourself." Alira felt the weight of every eye in the room settle on her, heavier than before, sharper, filled with an accusation that struck far deeper than mockery ever had. "I do not know what document you are referring to," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the storm rising in her chest. "I have not been in your study. I would not even know where it is located. A servant claims to have seen you near the study earlier this morning," Callum Bright interjected smoothly, stepping forward with an expression that almost looked like sympathy, though something colder lurked beneath it. "And the document was found in your own home, my king. What further explanation is required?" Alira turned toward the sound of Callum's voice, a slow, cold understanding beginning to settle over her. She had noticed, over the past weeks, the careful way Callum spoke around her, the subtle jabs disguised as concern, the quiet campaigning he had done among the council to see his own daughter Delphine take the position of Luna instead. She had dismissed it as ordinary jealousy. She now realized, far too late, that she had underestimated exactly how far his ambition might reach. "I did not take that document," Alira said, louder now, her composure beginning to crack under the weight of an accusation she could not physically defend herself against. "I do not even know where your study is. Someone placed it in my home. Someone wanted me to be blamed for this." "A convenient claim," Priscilla Thorne said coldly, her voice cutting through the hall. "Thornfield Kingdom cannot enter an agreement with a pack that cannot secure its own sensitive documents from sabotage within its own walls. We came here in good faith, and we find our trade terms destroyed by the very woman bonded to your king." Damien's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering between Priscilla and Alira, torn between the fury of a broken negotiation and the small, persistent voice inside him that could not quite reconcile the calm, unwavering woman standing before him with the image of a saboteur. "Alira," he said, his voice quieter now, though no less demanding, "look at me, and tell me the truth." "I am not looking at you," Alira said, and for the first time, something raw and wounded slipped into her voice. "I have not been able to look at anyone since I was 12 years old. But I am telling you the truth. I did not touch that document." A heavy silence fell over the hall. Damien stared at her, searching for something he could not name, some certainty that refused to come to him no matter how hard he reached for it. He wanted to believe her. Some quiet, buried part of him wanted desperately to believe her, but the evidence sat before him, undeniable and damning, and a king could not afford to let personal doubt outweigh the security of his entire kingdom. "The evidence speaks clearly enough," Callum said gently, pressing his advantage. Perhaps she resented the union forced upon her. Perhaps this was her way of striking back against a bond she never wanted. Alira's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I never wanted revenge," she said. "I wanted to be treated fairly. That is all I have ever wanted since I arrived in this kingdom." Damien rose slowly from his throne, descending the stone steps until he stood directly in front of her once again, close enough to feel the tension radiating from her small frame. He studied her face for a long moment, searching for a crack in her composure, a flicker of guilt, anything that might confirm what the evidence suggested. He found nothing but quiet, unwavering conviction. And yet, the trade agreement lay in ruins behind him. Priscilla Thorne's patience thinning with every passing second, his council whispering among themselves about weakness and betrayal, about a king who could not even control the loyalty of his own mate. "I want to believe you," Damien said quietly, so only she could hear, "but I cannot ignore what stands in front of me." "Then you are choosing evidence over truth," Alira said, her voice trembling now, though whether from anger or heartbreak, she could not say. "You are choosing convenience over me." Damien said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbearable, until finally, he turned back toward his throne, his shoulders rigid, his expression carved from stone. "The council will decide her fate," he said, refusing to look at Alira as he spoke. "I cannot make this decision alone." The council, already swayed by Callum's careful manipulation and eager to appease the furious Thornfield envoy, did not take long to reach their verdict. Alira listened as they debated her future, as though she were not standing directly in front of them, as though her voice, her truth, her years of quiet strength meant nothing against the weight of a single burned document and the whispered ambitions of men who had wanted her gone from the very beginning. She did not cry. She refused to give them that. But as the council's decision was finally announced, a decision that would strip her of any place within Ashgrove Kingdom and cast her out beyond its borders entirely, something inside Alira quietly, permanently changed. She had endured mockery. She had endured rejection. But betrayal, especially betrayal built on lies she had no way to defend herself against, cut deeper than anything she had experienced before. She turned toward where she knew Damien was standing, her voice steady, despite the devastation blooming in her chest. "You will regret this," she said quietly, "not because I wish harm upon you or your kingdom, but because truth has a way of surfacing, even when men are too proud or too afraid to look for it." She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked out of the great hall for what she believed, in that moment, would be the last time, her cane tapping steadily against the cold stone floor, her back straight despite the weight of injustice pressing down upon her shoulders. Behind her, Damien remained frozen on his throne, watching her disappear through the towering doors, a strange, hollow ache spreading through his chest that he refused to name, refused to examine, buried beneath the cold armor of duty he had worn his entire life. He told himself he had made the only decision a king could make. He did not yet know how wrong he truly was. The morning of the exile arrived cold and gray, fitting weather for what the entire kingdom had already begun calling the fall of the blind mate. Word had spread quickly through every corner of Ashgrove Kingdom, servants whispering in hallways, warriors murmuring in training yards, nobles exchanging knowing glances over breakfast tables, all of them certain they understood exactly what kind of woman Alira Voss truly was. Alira stood once more in the great hall, though this time there was no plea left to make, no defense left to offer. The council's decision had already been carved in stone the night before, and now she waited only to hear it spoken aloud, a final, formal ending to a bond that had barely been allowed to begin. Damien sat upon his throne, dressed in the full ceremonial armor of his position, though the weight of it seemed to sit differently on his shoulders than it had weeks before. His eyes, when they landed on Alira, held none of the fury from their first encounter. Instead, something quieter simmered beneath the surface, something he refused to acknowledge even to himself. Callum Bright stood beside the throne, his expression carefully arranged into solemn regret, though Alira could hear the faint satisfaction hiding beneath his measured tone as he read the council's official decree. "By unanimous decision of the Ashgrove Council," Callum announced, his voice carrying through the silent hall, "Alira Voss is hereby stripped of any claim to the title of Luna and formally exiled from the kingdom's borders. She is granted safe passage until sundown, after which she will be considered a trespasser, subject to the laws governing outsiders within Pact territory." The words landed with a finality that seemed to echo through the stone walls long after Callum had finished speaking. Alira kept her chin lifted, refusing to let the crowd witness even a flicker of the devastation building inside her chest. "The mate bond," Callum continued, "is declared severed in all matters of pack law and royal succession, though the council acknowledges that a true mate bond, forged by the moon goddess, cannot be undone by decree alone. This distinction, however, holds no bearing on the decision reached here today." Alira almost laughed at the strange cruelty hidden within that final sentence, The acknowledgement that the bond itself, the one thing that had brought her to this kingdom in the first place, could never truly be severed, even as they cast her out as though it meant nothing at all. Damien rose from his throne, and for a moment, silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. Elira turned her face toward him, though she could not see the conflict written plainly across his features, the small, involuntary clench of his jaw, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides as though physically restraining himself from crossing the distance between them. "Do you have anything to say?" Damien asked quietly, "before you leave this kingdom?" Elira considered his question for a long moment, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. A small, quiet act of defiance in a room that had already taken everything else from her. "Only this," she said finally, her voice steady and clear enough to carry to every corner of the hall. "You built your entire judgment of me on what your eyes told you the moment we met. You saw a blind woman, and decided, before I ever spoke a single word, that I was weak, that I was a burden, that I was somehow less than a king deserved. Everything that followed, this trial, this exile, was simply your pride searching for an excuse to confirm what you had already decided about me from the very beginning." A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs spread through the gathered crowd, but Elira continued, unwilling to let this final moment pass without speaking her full truth. "I did not take that document," she said. "Someone placed it in my home, because they knew exactly how easily you would believe the worst about me, and you proved them right without hesitation. That is not justice, my king. That is convenience, dressed in the robes of judgment." Damien said nothing, though something flickered behind his golden eyes, something that looked almost like the beginning of doubt, buried quickly beneath the rigid mask of duty he refused to let crack in front of his entire council. "Escort her to the border," he said finally, his voice rough, refusing to meet her sightless gaze any longer. Two guards stepped forward, though Elira raised a hand before they could touch her. "I do not need to be dragged out of a kingdom that never wanted me here," she said. "I will walk on my own." She turned, her cane tapping against the cold stone floor, and made her way toward the towering doors of the great hall for the final time. The crowd parted silently around her, some faces filled with quiet pity, others with poorly hidden satisfaction, though Elira felt none of it settle beneath her skin. She had already decided, somewhere deep inside herself, that she would not carry the weight of their judgment beyond these walls. Outside, the guards walked a respectful distance behind her, as she made her way through the kingdom she had called home for barely 2 months, past the training grounds where she had once silenced Garrick's mockery, past the herb garden where she had found brief moments of peace, past the small cottage that had never truly felt like hers. She did not look back, she could not have, even if she wanted to. At the edge of the kingdom's borders, where the paved roads gave way to rough forest paths, the guards finally stopped, watching as Elira continued forward alone, her figure growing smaller against the vast, unfamiliar wilderness stretching before her. She did not know where she would go. She did not know how she would survive alone, in a world that had already shown her how easily people believed the worst, how readily they discarded what they did not understand. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that she would survive. She had survived worse than this. She had survived a childhood illness that stole her sight, and a world that had spent years afterward insisting she was less capable because of it. She would survive this too. Behind her, unseen, Damien stood at the highest window of the palace, watching her small figure disappear into the tree line, until she vanished completely from view. The hollow ache in his chest had grown into something far heavier, something that felt disturbingly close to regret, though he refused, even now, to name it honestly. "You did what needed to be done, my king," Callum said quietly from behind him, though his voice carried a satisfaction he could not quite hide. Damien did not respond. He remained at the window long after Elira had disappeared, staring out at the darkening forest, an unfamiliar unease settling over him, that he could not shake no matter how firmly he told himself he had made the right choice. He did not yet know that the true saboteur behind the burned document still walked freely within his own palace walls, watching the outcome of their careful manipulation unfold exactly as planned. He did not yet know that his kingdom, stripped of its rightful Luna through lies and pride, would soon begin to pay a price far greater than any trade agreement lost. All he knew, standing alone at that window as the sun finally sank below the horizon, was that the silence inside the palace felt colder and emptier than it ever had before. The forest swallowed Illyra whole within the first hour of walking, the sounds of Ashgrove Kingdom fading behind her, until only the wilderness remained, filled with unfamiliar birdsong and the rustle of creatures she could not identify. She walked until her legs ached and her cane arm grew heavy, refusing to stop until the last traces of the kingdom's scent had faded entirely from the air around her. She did not know how many days passed before she stumbled upon the small village of Hollow Creek, exhausted, hungry, and running on nothing but stubborn will. The village sat far beyond the reach of any major pack territory, a quiet settlement of humans and a handful of wolves who had chosen to live outside the rigid structures of kingdom life. It was there, collapsed against the wooden fence surrounding a modest cottage at the edge of the village, that Illyra first met Odessa Marrow. "You look like you have not eaten in days," a rough, weathered voice said above her, followed by the sound of a door creaking open. "I have not," Illyra admitted, too exhausted for pride. Odessa, a reclusive healer known throughout the region for her sharp tongue and sharper instincts, took one look at the young woman collapsed against her fence, blind, alone, and clearly running from something painful, and made a decision that would change both their lives. "Well," Odessa said, extending a weathered hand to help her rise, "you had better come inside before you catch your death out here." The weeks that followed blurred together into a slow, steady rhythm of healing, both physical and otherwise. Odessa asked no questions about where Illyra had come from, or why she carried herself with the quiet, guarded posture of someone who had recently been deeply wounded. She simply offered food, shelter, and eventually, purpose. "You have good instincts," Odessa observed one morning, watching as Illyra carefully identified a patch of healing herbs by scent and texture alone, sorting them with a precision that surprised even the seasoned healer, better than most who can see perfectly well. "I have had a lot of practice," Illyra said simply. "Practice at what, exactly?" Illyra considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. "At proving people wrong about what I am capable of." Odessa laughed, a rich, genuine sound that Illyra had not heard directed toward her in longer than she cared to admit. "Then you will fit in well here," the healer said. "This village has never much cared what people are capable of, only what they choose to do with it." Under Odessa's guidance, Illyra began to rebuild not just her strength, but a version of herself that felt entirely her own, unshaped by the expectations or judgments of a kingdom that had never truly seen her at all. She learned the healing arts with a hunger that surprised even herself, memorizing the properties of countless herbs, the careful art of setting wounds, the delicate balance required to ease suffering without causing further harm. But it was not only her healing skills that grew sharper during those months in Hollow Creek. Something else began to develop as well, something Odessa noticed long before Illyra herself fully understood it. "You knew Garrett was lying about his injury before he even finished speaking," Odessa said one evening, after a young hunter had come to the cottage, claiming an accidental wound that Illyra had somehow known, instantly and without doubt, was the result of a fight rather than an accident. "I could hear it," Illyra said, though even she was not entirely certain that was the full truth. "Could you?" Odessa said, her tone thoughtful rather than doubtful. "Or is there something else at work here?" Over the following weeks, Odessa began testing Illyra in subtle ways, presenting her with strangers who carried secrets, watching as Illyra consistently, almost effortlessly, seemed to sense the truth hidden beneath their words. A merchant who claimed honest trade but harbored quiet guilt over cheating a neighboring village. A traveler who spoke calmly of his journey but carried a current of barely restrained fear beneath his voice. Illyra sensed each hidden truth with an accuracy that went far beyond simple observation. "You have a gift," Odessa said finally, one quiet evening, as they sat together near the cottage's small fireplace. "Beyond your other senses, a gift for sensing dishonesty, for feeling the weight of true intention behind a person's words. It is rare, even among wolves with full sight." Illyra sat with that revelation for a long moment, an unfamiliar mixture of emotions rising within her. Pride, certainly, but also a sharp, bitter irony that settled heavily in her chest. "If only I had possessed such a gift a few months ago," she said quietly. Odessa did not press for details, though she seemed to understand, in the careful, knowing way of someone who had lived many years and witnessed many forms of heartbreak, that Elira carried a wound far deeper than any physical injury she had treated in her cottage. Gifts have a strange way of arriving exactly when we need them most, Odessa said instead. Perhaps yours simply needed time and pain to fully awaken. As the months passed, word of the blind healer with uncanny instincts began to spread beyond Hollow Creek, drawing travelers from neighboring villages seeking her help, not only for physical ailments, but for guidance in matters of trust and truth. Elira found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, valued not despite what she lacked, but because of the unique strength her circumstances had forged within her. She built a quiet, steady life in Hollow Creek, one built on her own terms, shaped by her own hands. She trained daily with Odessa, sharpening both her healing skills and the strange, powerful instinct that had begun to feel less like a limitation overcome, and more like a genuine gift, fully embraced. And yet, some nights, when the village fell silent and the cottage grew quiet around her, Elira found her thoughts drifting back to Ashgrove Kingdom, despite every effort to leave it behind entirely. The bond, though severed in the eyes of pack law, remained stubbornly, painfully present beneath her skin, a quiet ache that refused to fade no matter how much distance she placed between herself and the kingdom that had cast her out. She told herself it would fade with time. She told herself, again and again, that Damien Ashgrove's judgment of her no longer mattered, that his opinion held no power over the life she was slowly, carefully rebuilding. She did not yet know that far beyond the borders of Hollow Creek, the very kingdom she was trying so hard to forget was beginning to unravel, piece by piece, under the weight of a broken bond and a truth that refused to stay buried forever. The first sign of trouble came in the form of failed crops, entire fields of wheat and barley withering overnight despite favorable weather and careful tending. Damien stood at the edge of the northern farmlands, watching his people struggle to understand why the earth itself seemed to be turning against them, a knot of unease tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the crops themselves. He told himself it was simple misfortune, an unlucky season, nothing more, but the unease refused to loosen its grip, especially as the failed harvest was quickly followed by a string of increasingly troubling incidents throughout the kingdom. Trade negotiations that had once come easily to him now collapsed at every turn, neighboring packs suddenly hesitant to align with Ashgrove Kingdom, citing vague, unexplained concerns that Damien could not quite pin down. Warriors who had trained together for years without incident began fighting among themselves over minor disputes, tempers flaring faster and hotter than ever before. Even the palace itself seemed to grow colder, the once vibrant halls now filled with a persistent, unshakable tension that no one could fully explain. "The pack feels it too, my king," said Old Marsh, the kingdom's eldest advisor and one of the few council members who had never fully trusted Callum Bright's counsel. "A wound in the mate bond does not simply disappear because you willed it away. It festers, it spreads." "I did not choose this," Damien said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "No," Old Marsh agreed, "but you chose to sever it rather than fight for the truth. That choice carries consequences of its own, whether you wish to acknowledge them or not." Damien dismissed the old advisor's words at the time, too proud, too stubborn to admit that a single decision made months ago might be responsible for the slow unraveling of everything he had worked so hard to build and protect. But as the weeks passed, and the troubles continued to mount, he found it increasingly difficult to ignore the pattern forming before him. He began sleeping poorly, plagued by restless nights filled with fragmented dreams he could not quite remember upon waking, though he always woke with the same lingering ache in his chest, the same phantom pull toward something, or someone, he refused to name, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. The final blow came during a council meeting nearly 4 months after Elira's exile, when word arrived that a rival pack from the Eastern Territories, sensing weakness in Ashgrove's suddenly fractured alliances, had begun amassing warriors along the border. "They believe us vulnerable," Callum Bright said, though for the first time, even his usually confident tone carried an edge of genuine concern. "Word has spread of our failed trade agreement with Thornfield Kingdom. Word has spread of the internal conflicts weakening our warriors. They see an opportunity, and they intend to take it." Damien sat rigid at the head of the council table, the weight of his kingdom's growing instability, pressing down on him with a force he could no longer dismiss as coincidence or bad luck. "We need every advantage available to us," Old Marsh said quietly, his eyes fixed on Damien with a knowing, patient expression, including the strength of a properly bonded Luna standing beside her king. "The moon goddess does not offer such bonds lightly, my king. Perhaps it is time to consider whether the true source of our troubles lies closer to home than we have been willing to admit." The words settled over Damien like a physical weight, dragging up memories he had spent months trying desperately to bury. Alira's steady voice in the great hall. The unwavering conviction in her final words before she disappeared beyond the kingdom's borders. The persistent ache in his own chest that he had told himself, again and again, was simply the natural fading of an unwanted bond, rather than what it truly was, an unhealed wound, growing worse, with every day he refused to face it. That night, alone in his private chambers, Damien finally allowed himself to sit with the full weight of doubt he had been avoiding for months. He thought of the burned document, still troubling in ways he had never fully investigated, too eager at the time to reach a swift resolution, rather than dig deeper into the truth of what had truly happened. He thought of the way Callum Bright had so smoothly, so conveniently, produced evidence against Alira, and how eagerly he had pushed for her immediate exile, rather than a thorough investigation. He thought of Callum's daughter Delphine, who had made no secret of her disappointment when Alira first arrived, hoping, as her father did, that she herself might one day stand as Luna beside the king. The pieces, scattered and ignored for months beneath his own stubborn pride, began slowly, uncomfortably arranging themselves into a pattern he had refused to see before. Damien rose from his seat and walked to the window overlooking the darkened kingdom below, the same window where he had once watched Alira's small figure disappear into the distant tree line. The ache in his chest, the one he had spent months trying to ignore, pulsed sharply, insistently, refusing to be silenced any longer. "What have I done?" he whispered into the empty room, the first honest admission he had allowed himself since the day he cast her out. He did not yet have proof of Callum's betrayal. He did not yet know exactly where Alira had gone, or whether she would ever be willing to hear anything he had to say after the way he had treated her. But for the first time since her exile, Damien allowed himself to consider a possibility he had refused to entertain before, that perhaps his pride, not her blindness, had been the true weakness threatening everything he claimed to protect. Somewhere far beyond his kingdom's borders, unaware of the storm slowly building in her absence, Alira continued building her quiet life in Hollow Creek, her wounds healing slowly beneath the careful guidance of Odessa Marrow's teachings. But fate, as it so often does, was not yet finished with either of them. The truth arrived not through careful investigation, but through pure, unexpected chance, in the form of a frightened young servant named Wren, who approached Damien 3 days after his midnight revelation at the window. She found him alone in his study, hesitating in the doorway for so long that he finally looked up from his papers and addressed her directly. "You have something to tell me," he said, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact, his instincts, as king, sharpened after months of growing suspicion. Wren stepped inside, closing the door carefully behind her, her hands twisting anxiously in front of her apron. "My king," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have spoken sooner. I was afraid. I am still afraid. But I cannot stay silent any longer, not after everything that has happened to this kingdom since she left." Damien set down his papers slowly, giving the young servant his full attention. "Speak freely," he said. "You have my word that no harm will come to you for telling the truth." Wren took a shaking breath before continuing. "On the morning the trade document went missing, I was cleaning the hallway outside your study. I saw Delphine Bright leaving your study, with a folded paper hidden beneath her shawl. I did not think much of it at the time. I assumed she had permission to be there. But later that day, when the accusations began against Lady Alira, I remembered what I had seen, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since." Damien felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest, the final piece of a puzzle he had spent months refusing to fully examine, now falling into place with brutal clarity. "Why did you not come forward sooner?" he asked, though his tone carried no anger, only a heavy, exhausted regret. "I was afraid of Lord Callum," Wren admitted, tears gathering in her eyes. "He holds great influence in this kingdom. and I am only a servant. I feared what might happen to me or my family if I spoke against his daughter without proof. I am sorry, my king. I am truly sorry." Damien rose from his desk, his mind already racing through the implications of what he had just heard. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said quietly. "The fault lies entirely with those who chose deception over honesty, and with myself, for being too eager to believe the worst, rather than seeking the full truth." He questioned Ren further, gathering every detail she could recall, before dismissing her with assurances of protection and gratitude for her courage. Once alone, he summoned Old Marsh immediately, relaying everything he had just learned. "We must proceed carefully," Old Marsh advised, though his expression carried a grim satisfaction at finally having concrete evidence to support suspicions he had long held privately. "Callum Bright has spent years building alliances within this council. An accusation without solid proof could fracture what little stability remains within our kingdom." "Then we will find solid proof," Damien said, a new, determined energy replacing the exhaustion that had weighed on him for months. The investigation that followed moved quickly, once Damien committed himself fully to uncovering the truth. Discreet questioning of palace staff revealed additional witnesses who had noticed Delphine's unusual behavior in the days surrounding the incident. Servants who had seen her nervously watching the study, guards who recalled her lingering near the fireplace in Alira's cottage, under flimsy excuses, shortly before the document was discovered burned within it. Piece by piece, the true sequence of events emerged with damning clarity. Delphine, encouraged and guided by her father's careful manipulation, had stolen the trade document and planted it in Alira's cottage, ensuring the blame would fall squarely on the newly arrived, vulnerable mate who possessed no allies within the kingdom to defend her. Callum's motive became equally clear once Damien began examining it honestly. For years, he had positioned his daughter as the ideal future Luna, cultivating alliances and favor among the council, in preparation for a bond he assumed was inevitable. Alira's arrival had shattered those carefully laid plans, and rather than accept defeat gracefully, Callum had chosen deception, exploiting Damien's own prejudice against Alira's blindness to eliminate her from the kingdom entirely. When Damien finally confronted Callum directly, summoning him to a private meeting within the study where the entire scheme had originated, the older wolf's confident facade crumbled with surprising speed under the weight of undeniable evidence. "I did what was necessary to protect this kingdom's future," Callum said, though his voice lacked its usual commanding authority, replaced instead by the desperate justification of a man caught in his own carefully constructed lie. "A blind Luna would have made us appear weak in the eyes of every rival pack watching us. I merely accelerated a decision you yourself had already begun to make. You destroyed an innocent woman's reputation and cast her out of her rightful place through lies," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous, years of restrained fury finally finding release. "You did not protect this kingdom. You nearly destroyed it, along with everything I once believed about justice and leadership." Callum was stripped of his council position immediately, his daughter Delphine banished from the palace in disgrace, though Damien, in a small act of mercy Alira herself might have approved of, spared them both from harsher punishment, choosing instead permanent exile from Ashgrove territory, rather than more severe consequences. But stripping Callum of his power did nothing to undo the months of damage already inflicted, nor did it erase the memory of Alira's steady, heartbroken voice as she had walked away from him for the final time. Damien stood alone in his study long after Callum's departure, the full weight of his own failure settling over him with crushing clarity. He had not simply been deceived by a scheming council member. He had allowed his own pride, his own prejudice against Alira's blindness, to make him vulnerable to that deception in the first place. He had wanted so badly to believe she was unworthy, that when convenient evidence appeared confirming his own biased assumptions, he had embraced it without hesitation, without proper investigation, without the basic fairness any accused person deserved, let alone his own fated mate. "I am sorry," he whispered to the empty room, though he knew the words meant nothing without action to follow them, without finding her again, and proving, through more than mere apology, that he had truly changed. He thought of the ache still lingering in his chest, the bond that had never fully faded despite months of forced separation and denial. He thought of Old Marsh's warning about wounds left to fester rather than heal. He thought, finally and completely, of Alira herself, wherever she now stood, likely believing he had never once doubted the false judgment he had passed against her. Damien made his decision that same night, standing alone in his study, as the truth finally, fully settled over him. He would find her. He would seek her forgiveness, no matter how long it took, no matter how far he needed to travel, or how deeply he needed to humble himself before her. He owed her that much, and far more besides, for the injustice he had allowed to unfold beneath his own roof. He did not know, as he began preparing for the journey ahead, that Alira had built an entirely new life for herself in his absence, one that no longer depended on his acceptance or his crown to hold meaning. He did not know how difficult it would truly be to earn back what his pride had so carelessly thrown away. But for the first time in months, Damien Ashgrove finally understood exactly what he had lost, and exactly what he needed to do to try, however imperfectly, to make it right. The search for Alira proved far more difficult than Damien had anticipated. He left the kingdom under Old Marsh's temporary guidance, traveling with only 2 trusted guards, and a determination that surprised even himself. A king accustomed to command, now reduced to the humble, uncertain role of a man searching for someone who had every reason to want nothing to do with him ever again. He began his search at the border, where Alira had last been seen, following the general direction of the forest path she had taken months earlier. But forests offered little in the way of clear trails, and villages scattered throughout the northern territories proved reluctant to share information about a blind traveler, with strangers claiming royal authority, especially strangers arriving from a kingdom known throughout the region for having cruelly exiled her in the first place. Word of Damien's search spread quickly, and not always kindly. In one village, an innkeeper flatly refused him lodging upon learning his identity, informing him bluntly that a king who cast out his own mate deserved no comfort from decent folk. In another, a group of young wolves openly mocked him, one going so far as to suggest that perhaps he too should experience what it felt like to be judged and discarded based on assumptions rather than truth. Damien endured each humiliation without argument, without invoking his authority or demanding respect he no longer felt entitled to. Each rejection, however painful, felt like a small, necessary piece of the reckoning he owed for the way he had treated Alira. Weeks passed with no solid leads, his frustration and worry growing with each passing day. He began to fear that perhaps she had traveled far beyond the northern territories entirely, perhaps deliberately choosing a path that would ensure he could never find her, could never force upon her the burden of his presence again. The breakthrough finally came in a small trading post, nearly 2 months into his search, when a merchant mentioned, almost in passing, a renowned blind healer operating out of a village called Hollow Creek, known throughout the region for her uncanny ability to sense truth and dishonesty in those who sought her help. Damien's heart pounded with a hope he had not allowed himself to feel in weeks. He asked careful, measured questions, learning what details he could, without revealing too much of his own identity or intentions, and by the following morning, he was traveling toward Hollow Creek with a renewed sense of purpose that had been steadily eroding under the weight of failure and doubt. He arrived at the edge of the village just as the sun began setting, casting long shadows across the modest cottages and quiet streets. He dismounted near the village center, his guards remaining a respectful distance behind him, and asked the first villager he encountered where he might find the healer everyone spoke of with such reverence. The elderly woman he addressed studied him carefully before answering, her eyes narrowing with a suspicion Damien had grown uncomfortably familiar with over the past 2 months. "You have the look of someone searching for trouble," she said. "Or perhaps trouble is searching for you." "I mean no harm," Damien said quietly. "I only wish to speak with her." The woman studied him a moment longer, before finally pointing toward a modest cottage at the edge of the village, nestled beneath a canopy of old trees. "Third house past the well," she said, "though I would think carefully about whatever brought you here, stranger." That woman has earned every bit of peace she has found in this village. Damien thanked her and walked slowly toward the cottage, his heart pounding harder with every step, uncertain whether it beat from hope, fear, or the overwhelming weight of everything he needed to say once he finally stood before her again. He found her in the small garden beside the cottage, kneeling among rows of carefully tended herbs, her hands moving with the same quiet confidence he remembered from their very first encounter, though everything else about her seemed subtly, undeniably changed. She carried herself differently now, lighter somehow, freed from the rigid formality of palace life, settled into a peace that had clearly grown from her own strength, rather than anyone else's acceptance. He stood frozen at the edge of the garden, unable to speak, unable to move, simply watching her for a long moment, before she suddenly went still, her head tilting slightly in his direction. "I know that presence," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the shock he had braced himself for, only a careful, guarded wariness, though I had hoped never to feel it again. "Illyra," Damien said, her name feeling foreign and precious on his tongue after months of forced silence. She rose slowly, brushing soil from her hands, her expression unreadable as she faced the direction of his voice. "Why are you here, Damien?" "I came to find you," he said, taking a hesitant step closer. "I came because I learned the truth about what happened. Callum and Delphine orchestrated everything. The stolen document, the false evidence, all of it. You were innocent, exactly as you told me from the very beginning, and I chose not to believe you." Illyra remained silent for a long moment, absorbing his words with a stillness that gave nothing away. "It took you this long to learn something I told you clearly, from the very first moment you accused me," she said finally, her voice quiet, but edged with a pain that had not fully healed, despite the months and distance between them. "I know," Damien said, his voice thick with the weight of genuine shame. "I know I failed you in every possible way. A king, a mate, should never fail someone he claims to protect. I did not come here expecting forgiveness. I came because you deserve to know the truth, and because I could not continue living with the weight of what I did to you, without at least attempting to make it right." Illyra studied him for a long, silent moment, her sightless eyes somehow still managing to convey the depth of everything she had endured since leaving his kingdom. "Making it right," she repeated slowly. "Do you understand what that would even require, Damien? Do you understand what you took from me that day, beyond a title, beyond a home?" "No," Damien admitted honestly, "but I am willing to learn, however long it takes, if you are willing to allow me the chance." Behind her, the cottage door creaked open, and Odessa Marrow stepped outside, her sharp eyes immediately assessing the tense scene unfolding in her garden. "Illyra," she said cautiously, "is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Odessa," Illyra said, though her voice carried a weariness that suggested otherwise. She turned back toward Damien, her expression settling into something firm and unwavering. "You may have learned the truth, Damien. You may even feel genuine remorse for what happened. But truth and remorse do not erase months of humiliation, of exile, of rebuilding a life from nothing, because the man meant to protect me chose pride over patience." "I understand," Damien said quietly. "I do not think you do," Illyra replied. "Not yet, but perhaps, if you are truly willing to learn, you will begin to understand exactly how much you need to prove before I ever consider trusting you again." She turned and walked back toward her cottage, leaving Damien standing alone in the quiet garden, as the last light of evening faded into darkness around him, uncertain whether her words had offered him a door left open, however slightly, or simply confirmed the full weight of everything his pride had cost him. He did not leave Hollow Creek that night. He remained, quietly, patiently, prepared to prove through action what his words alone could never fully repair. Damien remained in Hollow Creek for 3 full weeks, refusing every gentle suggestion from his guards that they return to Ashgrove Kingdom, where Old Marsh continued managing affairs in his absence with growing impatience. He rented a small room above the village tavern, and each morning, he walked to Odessa's cottage, uncertain whether Illyra would even agree to see him, uncertain whether patience alone could ever truly repair what his pride had broken. At first, she refused to speak with him entirely, allowing Odessa to relay brief, pointed messages, informing him that his presence in the village changed nothing about her feelings toward him. Damien accepted each refusal without argument, without pressure, choosing instead to demonstrate, through quiet, consistent action, that he intended to remain until she was ready, however long that required. He began helping around the village in small, unassuming ways, carrying supplies for elderly residents, repairing a collapsed fence near the well, assisting local hunters with tasks that required strength rather than status. He never once invoked his title as king, never once expected special treatment or gratitude for his efforts. He simply worked, day after day, allowing the village to witness a version of himself he had rarely shown anyone during his years ruling from behind palace walls. Word of his quiet, humble presence eventually reached Illyra, carried through the casual conversations of villagers who had grown curious about the strange, dedicated stranger working alongside them, without complaint or expectation. "He fixed old Bertram's roof yesterday," Odessa mentioned casually one evening, watching Illyra's expression carefully as she prepared herbs for the following day's healing work. "Refused any payment. Said it was the least he could do." "That does not undo what he did to me," Illyra said, though her voice carried less certainty than it had weeks earlier. "No," Odessa agreed gently, "but perhaps it is a beginning worth considering." It was nearly a month after Damien's arrival that Illyra finally agreed to speak with him directly, meeting him in the same garden where he had first found her, though this time she initiated the conversation herself, rather than simply enduring his presence. "You have not left," she observed, settling onto a small wooden bench near the herb rows. "I told you I would remain as long as necessary," Damien said, standing at a respectful distance, careful not to crowd her space as he once might have without thought. "I meant it." "The village has grown fond of you," Illyra said, a faint, reluctant note of surprise coloring her voice. "That surprises me, given everything I know about the man who once called me a curse in front of his entire kingdom." Damien flinched at the reminder, though he did not argue against the truth of it. "I was that man," he said quietly. "I am not proud of who I was during those months. I let pride convince me that strength only existed in the form I had been taught to recognize since childhood, and I refused to see the strength standing directly in front of me, because it did not match my narrow expectations." Illyra remained silent, listening carefully, though her expression remained guarded. "I have spent every day since learning the truth, trying to understand exactly how deeply I failed you," Damien continued. "Not simply through the exile itself, but through every small moment leading up to it, every time I allowed others to speak over you, every time I chose convenience over genuine investigation, every time I let my own fear of appearing weak outweigh basic fairness toward someone who had done nothing to deserve my cruelty." "Words," Illyra said quietly, though not unkindly, "are easy, Damien. I have heard many words over the years, from people eager to explain away their own failures." "Then let me show you instead," Damien said, and before she could respond, he lowered himself slowly to his knees, in the soft earth of the garden, directly before her, his head bowed, in a posture no king within his territory had ever witnessed him assume for anyone. Illyra went still, her sightless eyes widening slightly as she registered the shift in his position through the subtle change in his voice and breathing. "I am not asking you to forget what happened," Damien said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability of his position. "I am not asking you to simply forgive me, because I have finally learned the truth, or because I have spent weeks proving myself useful around your village. I am asking you to allow me the chance to keep proving myself, for as long as it takes, in whatever way you deem necessary, because you deserved better from the very beginning, and I intend to spend whatever time is required making that truth known through my actions, rather than empty apologies." The garden fell silent around them, filled only with the quiet rustle of evening wind through the herb rows, and the distant sound of village life continuing beyond the cottage walls. Illyra sat motionless for a long moment, processing the weight of a king kneeling before her, stripped entirely of the pride that had once cost her everything. "Rise, Damien," she said finally, her voice softer than it had been throughout their entire conversation. He rose slowly, though he remained close, watching her carefully for any sign of what she might be feeling. "I will not pretend the pain of these past months has simply disappeared, because you have finally arrived at understanding what should have been obvious from the beginning," Illyra said. "But I have also spent these months learning that holding on to anger indefinitely serves no one, least of all myself. I am willing to allow you the chance to prove yourself, Damien, not because I owe you forgiveness, but because I believe genuine growth deserves acknowledgement when it occurs." "That is more than I deserve," Damien said quietly. "Perhaps," Illyra agreed. "But I did not survive everything I have endured by measuring my choices solely on what others deserve. I make my own decisions, based on my own judgment, and my judgment tells me that the man kneeling before me tonight is not the same man who cast me out months ago." A cautious hope began to build in Damien's chest, though he was careful not to let it overwhelm the humility he had worked so hard to cultivate over the past weeks. "What would you have me do?" he asked, "to continue earning that judgment?" Illyra considered the question carefully before answering. "Return to your kingdom," she said. "Rule it well. Learn from the mistakes that nearly destroyed everything you claim to value. And when you have truly proven, through sustained action rather than temporary gestures, that you understand the full weight of what genuine partnership requires, then perhaps we will speak again about what future, if any, exists between us." Damien nodded slowly, accepting her terms without argument, understanding, finally and completely, that trust once broken required far more than a single moment of confession to rebuild. "I will do exactly as you ask," he said. "However long it takes." Illyra offered him something that was not quite a smile, but carried within it the faintest promise of one, a small, cautious opening in the careful walls she had built around herself since the day he first rejected her. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but for the first time since arriving in Hollow Creek, Damien allowed himself to believe that forgiveness, however distant, might genuinely be possible. 6 months passed before Illyra returned to Ashgrove Kingdom, and when she finally did, she arrived not as an exiled outsider slipping quietly through the gates, but as an honored guest, invited by formal decree and welcomed by a kingdom that had spent those same months slowly learning the full truth of what their king had once cost them. Damien had kept his word entirely. He returned to his throne within days of their conversation in Odessa's garden, though he ruled differently now, shaped by everything he had learned during his weeks of humble labor in Hollow Creek. He restructured the council, removing those who had supported Callum's schemes without question, and elevating voices, like old marshes, that had always valued truth over convenience. He established new protocols requiring thorough investigation before any accusation could result in punishment, a direct, permanent acknowledgement of the injustice Illyra herself had suffered. He wrote to her regularly throughout those months, careful letters that spoke honestly of his efforts and struggles as king, never pressuring her for forgiveness, never assuming progress where none had yet been earned. Illyra responded when she chose to, her replies growing gradually warmer as the months passed, though she remained firmly rooted in Hollow Creek, continuing her work alongside Odessa, unwilling to rush back into a life that had once caused her so much pain. It was Old Marsh, ultimately, who suggested the formal invitation, recognizing that Ashgrove Kingdom's continued instability stemmed not merely from Damien's past mistakes, but from the persistent, unhealed wound of a mate bond still left unresolved. Damien had hesitated before sending the invitation, uncertain whether he had truly earned the right to ask her back, but Illyra's response, arriving faster than any letter before it, had settled his uncertainty entirely. She would come, she wrote, not as his Luna, not yet, but as herself, on her own terms, to see with her own understanding exactly what kind of kingdom he had built in her absence. The kingdom that welcomed her upon arrival looked remarkably different from the one she had left in disgrace. The training grounds, where Garrick had once mocked her openly, now included a formal program teaching warriors to fight without relying solely on sight, developed under Damien's direct order, after he finally understood how deeply he had underestimated the value of senses beyond mere vision. Garrick himself, humbled by months of witnessing the consequences of the kingdom's collective prejudice, greeted her with a genuine, respectful apology that surprised them both. The council chamber, once filled with the whispered ambitions of men like Callum Bright, now included representatives chosen for their integrity rather than their political maneuvering, several of them openly acknowledging the debt the kingdom owed to Illyra for exposing, however unwillingly, the corruption that had nearly destroyed them from within. Illyra walked through the palace halls slowly, absorbing every change, every small, deliberate shift that spoke to genuine transformation rather than superficial gesture. When she finally reached the Great Hall, the same room where she had once been publicly humiliated and later formally exiled, she found Damien waiting for her, standing not upon his throne, but at the base of the stone steps, level with where she stood. "You changed the room," she observed, sensing the subtle shift in the space around her, the throne now positioned differently, no longer looming over the entire hall with quite the same imposing dominance it once held. "I changed many things," Damien said quietly. though none of them matter nearly as much as the changes I have tried to make within myself. Alira walked slowly toward him, stopping at the same distance she had once maintained during their very first, painful encounter in this very hall. But everything about the moment felt different now, softened by months of genuine effort, tempered by the hard-won understanding they had both cultivated since that first devastating meeting. "I have watched carefully these past months," she said. "Through your letters, through what I have witnessed today, through the accounts of villagers and travelers who passed through Hollow Creek speaking of a king who finally learned to listen rather than assume. I believe you, Damien. I believe you have genuinely changed." Hope flickered cautiously across Damien's face, though he remained still, waiting for her to continue, rather than allowing his own eagerness to rush the moment. "I am not offering you my full trust today," Alira continued carefully. "That will take time to rebuild, perhaps a great deal of it. But I am willing to remain in Ashgrove Kingdom, to see what genuine partnership between us might look like, built this time on honesty rather than assumption, on patience rather than pride." "That is everything I could have hoped for," Damien said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer felt the need to hide behind royal composure. The kingdom celebrated Alira's return, not with the rigid formality of her first arrival, but with genuine warmth, a community slowly learning to value strength in forms beyond the narrow definitions they had once clung to so tightly. Over the following months, Alira gradually resumed her rightful place beside Damien, not as a decoration upon his throne, but as an equal partner in every decision that shaped the kingdom's future, her unique instincts and unwavering integrity proving invaluable in ways the council quickly came to respect and rely upon. The mate bond, wounded but never truly broken, slowly began to heal between them, strengthened not by the desperate rush of reconciliation, but by the steady, patient work of two people determined to build something far stronger than what had existed before, a partnership rooted in mutual respect rather than blind assumption. Damien never forgot the lesson his pride had once cost him so dearly. He ruled differently for the rest of his reign, always mindful of the danger hidden within convenient assumptions, always willing to seek deeper truth rather than accept the easiest explanation. And Alira, who had once walked away from Ashgrove Kingdom believing she would never return, found herself instead standing firmly within it once more, not as the broken exile they had cast out, but as the strong, unwavering Luna the kingdom had always needed, even when its king had been too blind to see it. Years later, when their story was told throughout the Northern Territories, it was not remembered simply as a tale of a cruel king finally humbled, but as a testament to the quiet, unbreakable strength Alira Voss had carried within herself from the very beginning, strength that no amount of prejudice or injustice had ever truly managed to diminish.